So I'm on Encyclopedia Britannica, and this is what I've found. Under the word Trinity for Christianity, when I look down to try and find the origin of it, where it started, this is what it says. And I think that for me, if I were to try to believe in the Trinity, this would be quite disturbing. Because what if it is true? What if the Encyclopedia Britannica actually got it right? It says, the doctrine developed gradually over several centuries and through many controversies. So, take for example this. If I read this here, to give it a date, so to speak, it says it wasn't until later in the 4th century that the distinctness of the three and their unity were brought together in a single orthodox doctrine of one essence and three persons. It looks like a late invention. But how do we know? Well, if I go to Wikipedia, let's look for the first defense. So if I run a search, first defense, it says the first defense of the Trinity was in the early 3rd century by the early church father Tertullian. Okay. So he defended his theology against Praxeus. Well, what is Praxeus? Let's find out. Well, firstly, it says he noted that the majority of the believers in his day found issue with his doctrine. Right. Suppose, for example, just for a second, that the Encyclopedia Britannica was right. Imagine this timeline. The days of Judaism have the Jewish God. One God, one person. Plain, as simple as you can get. Imagine just for a second that people began introducing, after Christianity was formed, because that was really a sect of Judaism at first. Imagine that it was people after the apostles, after that, in the 2nd, 3rd and 4th centuries, if that was when people started to argue about the Trinity and the identity of God, that would mean that all the apostles believed one thing and this later thing came in later, the Trinity came in later. Now that's the timeline that many encyclopedias will put forward. But how do we know that? How would they know that? How would anyone know that? Let's look at what was written in this source. Against Praxeus. Praxeus, by the way, let's just be clear on what that is, because that's a word in itself. He was someone who believed in monarchianism. That's a hard word to pronounce. Basically, he believed in the sole deity of God the Father. So we've got here Tertullian, believing in the Trinity, writing against someone else who refuses to believe that, and instead this one believes in the sole deity of God the Father. Like a Jew. Okay, so he's got the Jewish view, the traditional view, the one held by the people who wrote the Old Testament. Now, I believe also the New Testament, that the Bible didn't contradict itself. I believe it didn't teach two gods, one that contradicts the first one. But let's just suppose for a second. Let's just see. Okay, so he's sticking to the old-fashioned view. Was he in the minority or the majority? This is that source. So let's see what he writes. And it's right here. He says, the simple, indeed, I will not call them unwise and unlearned, who always constitute the majority of believers, are startled at the dispensation of the three in one, on the ground that their very rule of faith withdraws them from the world's plurality of gods to the one only true God, not understanding that although he is the only God, he must yet be believed in his own oikonomia. And he just goes on. Let's focus just for a second on this. It says, they always constitute the majority. Oh no, hold on, I'll just get rid of that. I don't know why that just did that. Anyway, you can see what I've got there. They always constitute the majority of believers. So Tertullian comes in with a new idea that startles people. Who does it startle? The majority of believers. That's why Wikipedia says here he noted that the majority of the believers in his day found issue with his doctrine. So, I mean, take for example, right? Let's look at how weak some of the quotes that you might be told, oh, but there are certain people that mentioned a triune, a trinity. They mentioned the three in the same sentence. That must have been referring to the triune Godhead, right? Actually, no. Take for example this. I can't get that to work. Does this sound like the Trinity to you? But people have picked it out and said, that means the Trinity. No, it doesn't. It says here, the first of the early church fathers to be recorded using the word Trinity was Theophilus of Antioch, writing in the late 2nd century. He defines the Trinity as God, his word, and his wisdom. Sophia. Wisdom. Why not spirit? Do you see how there's a problem here? This man was not referring to the Trinity, to the Godhead, that's believed by later believers. So when I look at this, it kind of indicates to me that there are people who wish to twist early sources and early quotes. But if we really dig deep into those quotes, we find that the Trinity is a minority view being spread by some of the most arrogant, learned men, and that they seed this idea into the church. The majority of believers don't believe it. They reject it because they started off as a Jewish sect. They had the Jewish view of God. Anyway, sorry to make such a long message, such a long video. I'd love to know your thoughts. What are your thoughts on that, please? Thank you. Please write it in the comments below. Thank you.